In this video, I will be covering Chapter 12 in Gerald Stevens's Introduction to Greek Grammar textbook. And Chapter 12 is on page 175, and it covers contract verbs. Okay, so here's what contract, and he's actually, by the way, going to throw in some other stuff at the end on understanding a certain type of genitive and some other historical present. He's going to throw in some what we call syntax stuff in there, but the main thing that this chapter is about is this thing called contract verbs. Now, what are contract verbs? Contract verbs are verbs that their stem ends in a vowel, an E, an O, or an A, an epsilon, an omicron, or an alpha. Now, if a verb ends with a vowel, what's going to happen is when you add your endings, remember those endings you learned back at the beginning in chapter 2 and 3, O, ace, A, remember this, O, and that's terrible writing. Let me write that. Just wrote them up here real quick. Remember these? This is the active endings. O, ace, A, omen, ete, usi, and then the other ones will be my, ed, time, meteste, untai. Remember those? Now, those are the middle passive endings. Active or the middle passive endings, if you, what happens is when you add those to words that have their stem ending in a vowel, the epsilon, alpha, or omicron, there's going to be a reaction. The vowel, the thematic vowel that's in there in those endings. Remember, you learned those thematic vowels. There's a thematic vowel pattern, O, E, E, O, E, O. That thematic vowel is going to come into contact with the vowel at the end of the word, and they're going to contract. They're going to kind of squeeze together, and you're going to get a spelling change. That's what contract vowels are all about. And what he's trying to alert you to on page 175 and all the way to top of 177 is just say, hey, you're going to see some weird things happen whenever you have some verbs that have a vowel at the end of the stem and they come into contact with that thematic vowel, they're going to contract. Now, you just have to know that and be able to recognize it, so you don't get tripped up by the spelling when you go to locate it. You know, this is why this matters. So you can recognize the location. Now, what does he mean by contract? Let me put it this way. There are two little helpers that he gives you to help you recognize or kind of identify contract vowels. Number one identifying marker, the easiest, fastest way to recognize you have a contract vowel is you have a circumflex over where the ending or thematic vowel should be. Remember, most verbs, in fact, you may have not have noticed, but up to this point, but verbs almost always have acute or a grave accent mark. They rarely have a circumflex accent mark. So when you see a circumflex over a verb ending, it's a trigger. It's like a ding, ding, ding. Little bells are going off. I got a contract vowel. That thematic vowel and the end of the stem have come together and created they've been volatile and kind of squeezed together and made something new, a new letter there. That's number one. Look for the circumflex over the thematic, where the thematic vowel should be. The second one is to basically know this chart, which I put on the top here, which he has as his table 12.3. What he means by this is, if you look at a verb and you have where that thematic vowel would be, you have an omega. That means that the letter hiding behind that could be the A, the O, or the E. If you have an OU there, that means it could be the E or the O. It's just, this chart helps you to understand the pattern of changes. So if I have, for example, let's say the end of the vowel ends with an A. What I'm going to get, there's only two options that I'm going to get when it comes into some of those endings, OSA, OSA, omen, ete, usi, or even the middle passive, which I haven't written on the board yet, my e, tai, metste, untai from chapter 3. If the verb ends in an A, like this one does at the end of the stem, it's either going to be, I'm either going to have an omega with a circumflex, or I'm going to have one of these alphas with a circumflex. It's never going to look like this, or this, and that's what this little chart here, table 12.3, helps you to kind of learn the pattern of contracts and how some of those vowels tend to come together. And then he gives you chart examples of them in 12.1 and 12.2. So let me see if I can help you understand how this is going to go. I just to try to put it on the board here. I took a couple of examples he gives you on page 176, and I'm going to kind of work it out. So you're always, when you learn contract verbs, when you learn verbs, you don't learn them as contract verbs. And there's nothing in there that says, oh, this is a contract verb. You'll only know it's a contract verb because it has a vowel at the end of the stem. Now, in the dictionary or lexical form, it'll always show the ending, that first person singular ending, plus the end. But really, you'll never see it like this in the Greek text. Why? Because this is the pre-contract form. You're learning it as a vocabulary word just so you can kind of learn and remember. You learn this as a vocabulary and memorizing this as vocabulary. You learn that the A is at the end, or this poieo, you learn that the E is at the end. That's the main reason they give it to you like that. But really in the Greek text, it's always going to have an ending on it, and so it's going to be contracted. You're never going to see it look like this. So for example, this is what it means to contract. So let's take an example. This is your word here, poieo, and if you add that to your active endings here, what's going to happen is you're going to get a contract, because O is your first person singular ending. You're going to get a contract. That E is going to come into that O, and it's going to squeeze together. Put it too far apart. And it's going to look like this. You say, well, where did the E go? Well, it joined together to the omega, and that circumflex tells me it's hiding in there. Those two letters came together and made one letter, the O. Now, let's say I didn't know. Let's just say I didn't know this was the original word, and I come across this word right here, poio, in the Greek text. I'm gonna recognize this as a verb because I've memorized my word. Or let's say you didn't and you look it up. You're going to find that in the dictionary. And then you're going to say, oh, but I got a circumflex, therefore I've got a contract of some kind. Now, even if you don't remember that's an E there, if you know this chart up here, if I have an omega at the end, that's going to tell me it could be the E, the O, or the A. That one doesn't help me as much. Some of the other ones will, though. They'll narrow them down. For example, if I have an O, omicron iota at the end, with the circumflex, I know that the vowel that's disappeared, is sort of hiding there, that's come together and contracted, is actually an O. So sometimes this one is the most ambiguous, and this one can be ambiguous. These three, you always will know what's behind it, okay? So let's look at another one. So let's say I take poieo, I'm going to make it second person singular. You do, or some, you do. So what would happen? The epsilon comes into contact with the epsilon. Those two come together, and what are they going to make? And you see this on your chart there. I should try to get too far apart. Poies. Notice I got the circumflex. I got this one didn't change too much because there's already an iota there, so you got this epsilon iota. There it is, and I can predict. Let's again pretend I didn't know this. I can predict what letter was at the end there, because if I got an iota, an epsilon iota, I'm going to have an E. There was an E there, and sure enough, there it is. Now, here's the thing about contract vowels. You don't have to be able to do this process. Okay, if you're going, oh, I've got to try to learn how to do that, the answer is no, not at all. Just learn this chart right here so that you can be able to recognize if I've got an omega at the end, it could be an E, O, or A. This just helps you with the spelling, just helps you to locate it. The truth is, all you've got to know is if I see a circumflex on there, I've got a contract, so that you don't lose the verb. Because if you've memorized this, you're going to see this in the text, and you may get confused and go, I don't know that verb, because the spelling looks different. Oh, but I got a contract. Oh, wait a minute, so what letter is missing? Well, it's an E. Oh, now I remember that verb. That's the only reason you need to know it. So here's the key about contract verbs. You just got to understand that little change is going to happen there with verbs that end in O, E, or A, the omicron, epsilon, or the alpha. Now, the thing about contract verbs, and he says this on page 177, that last little paragraph, contracts affect the form only. It doesn't affect the meaning at all. It's just, he's trying to clue you into this little volatile thing so that you don't get tripped up. and not be able to locate them when you see them in the text. So let's say I add it to here. I shouldn't probably go through all of these, but because I don't want to make this video too long. Poye, o, umen. There you go. Okay, so this is one of the examples I want to give you before I move on. So again, this is an example of why contract verbs matter, just so you don't get tripped up by the verb. Because let's say you learn this vocabulary word, but then you come across this in the text, and you go, I have no idea what that word is. I didn't memorize that word. But I know it's a verb. Oh, look, because I see my ending there, and I've got contract. And so if I've learned my little chart here, if I've got an OU, I can almost guess what that letter is hiding behind there. That was an omicron, but it's part of my thematic vowel. It's part of my ending, and it came into contact with the E, and that E and that O came together, and they made this diphthong, the omicron upsilon. They contracted and made a new vowel sound of that little diphthong, and there it is. That's the main reason you need to know about contract. So that's the big new idea. Nothing new to memorize other than to be aware of it, and maybe to learn this chart right here so that you can spot those spelling changes when you try to locate a contract verb. The rest of the chapter is giving you some heads up. There are about 3 or 4 things, some heads up on some what we call syntax issues. And this is kind of cool. This is where you get into a little bit of interpretation of Greek language. By the way, I just gave you the active pattern, trying to make the video a little bit shorter. The same thing works for the middle passive. If I were to, before I give you, I should do this really so you guys don't get too confused. Let's say I want to do middle passive. I'll just give you one here real quick. Let's go to this alpha verb. So this verb ends with an alpha there. So let's say, so your middle passives, remember, I'm sorry, yeah, your middle passive ending are my, a, tai, meta, ste, untai. Okay, and you're going to have the same thematic vowels here. O E E O E O. So technically it's O. There's an E there. O E E O E O. That's technically what's happening, even though you may not have memorized it like that. Now what happens is when these endings come into contact with this contract vowel, you're going to have volatile reactions. These reactions. Let me get my black marker out and I'll show you. So let's say I take these, let me pick one that you can kind of spot. One that you can kind of spot a little bit. Okay, this one would be good. So let's say I want to take it, say we love. That's the word for to love. So I want to say agape, we love. So I'm going to put it here. It's going to look like this. And that omicron, that thematic vowel, is going to come into contact with the alpha, and it's going to do that. And so you see that on your, this is an example method. Yeah, this is an example. Remember, he says in the page, I wouldn't have even caught this. He says in the page that there are rare occasions where you don't get the circumflex, and this is one of those cases, but it's very rare. But notice again, you may look at this and go, gosh, what happened to the A there? Well, the A and the omicron came together and created this contract vowel. So again, it's just taking that stem, putting it with the middle passive endings, and you're going to get that little volatile change as the E, the O come into contact with the A. And you can see that in chart and table 2.2. Table 2.1 is all your active endings. Table 2.2 is all your middle passive endings. So that's that. The rest of the chapter is going to give you some syntax, and this is pretty cool. This is where you get into some interpretive issues of thinking through Greek, not just for morphology, how words are formed, which is mostly what you're learning, but he's going to dip the toe in the water, so to speak, of syntax and help you think through some aspects of interpretation. So the first thing he wants you to see is there's a little bit of an idiom with cases for direct object, page 177 and 178. I'm just going to summarize it for the sake of time real quickly. On page 177, 178, what he's going to say is there are certain verbs that just sort of call for different cases outside of the normal direct object case. So when you think of a direct object of a verb, you think of the accusative case. But he says if you think about some verbs, they just inherently call for a different case or a different prepositional construct as the object. And he gives you some examples there. Do you believe in capitalism? And so in English, you always, a lot of times, when you use that word believe, a lot of times, whatever the object, technically, that's a transitive verb. So whatever the object is, we tend to want to put that in preposition in there. He says, well, the Greek has a way to do this as well. They have certain verbs that just kind of call out for cases other than the accusative case to make them make sense. And he's going to give you three main examples there. And these are examples that are used often in the New Testament. So you just kind of want to learn them and then learn their cases. And this is on page 178. The word to follow, akolutheo. Akolutheo is the first example. And notice it is going to use as its object dative case, not accusative. Dative case. And then akuo, which is to hear, is the second example. It will use either a genitive or sometimes it could use the accusative. A genitive or an accusative. So notice the first example. I'll write it on the board real quick. The first example on page 178. I'll write it. I have to write it on 2 lines. I wrote it too big. Tu mes phones. Phones. Okay. Okay. Akue mu tes phones. So this is, if we were to parse this out, if we knew our vocabulary. I can't remember if you've gotten this word yet or not in vocabulary. This means to hear. So I've got the, think about your endings, oas, a, so he hears, and then I've got a genitive. This is a pronoun from your pronoun chapter. It's a possessive pronoun, my, and then you've got this, think of your articles, try to parse it out real quick. Okay, that is a feminine genitive singular article. Notice it is in concord with this noun, phones, which means voice. So he hears my voice. But think about this for a second. This is a genitive case being used as a direct object of akuo, to hear, akuo. So you go, well, wait a minute. How is it that why isn't it accusative? This is an example. That's the point of this whole page in this book. This is a kind of verb that just kind of calls for a different case to finish out its idea. Why does this matter? Because if you don't know these three verbs and they take different cases, sometimes your translation will come out really awkward. So for example, try to translate this very woodenly based on what you've learned in genitives. And what it would sound like is something like, he hears my voice. Or he hears of my voice. He hears of my voice. Well, that's not entirely wrong, but that doesn't sound really smooth, does it? He hears of my voice. Really, we would say he hears my voice. So even though it's in genitive, you got to go, oh, akuo takes genitive as direct object. So you'll translate it like it's an accusative. And then the third one is pistuo, right? Very, very common in the New Testament. This is the verbal form of faith, which is usually translated believe, because we don't have a verb form for in English for faith. We don't say he's faithing, so we say he's believing. So this word believe can take the dative or the accusative case with some prepositions, and he gives you several examples. What do you have to know about this? Just know that those three verbs can take other cases, like the genitive or the dative, as direct objects. That's what you got to know, so try to learn that. On page 179, he's going to introduce you to a new copulative verb, huparko. I don't have a whole lot to say there. Learn it as a vocabulary word. It's not used that often. It's a throwback to some more classical Greek, and so you're not going to see it very often at all in a lot of the New Testament. I think you see it more in Luke and in Paul, some of Paul's writings. So it's just remember, you get copulative verbs are ami and ginomai, are the two workhorses, and then now this one, who, you got rough breathing, huparco is another copulative, which is usually translated exists to something like something exists to me, and usually has this possessive idea, but it can be translated simply is. It's like a being verb, okay? Historical present is a syntactical nuance of the Greek language, and he explains it pretty well in there. In other words, you're going to have some verbs that are going to be his point there is in storytelling, you're going to have present. You want to there are some tenses that are going to be present tense in their form, but he's going to say should be translated in the past tense. And we do this with storytelling. He explains that in there. If you were to translate it in the present tense, it's not entirely wrong. Notice historical present is a present tense verb. The formation looks the same. It's the same endings. O, es, a, omen, edi, usi, ma, ed, time, and stay, in time. It's exactly formed the same. It's what we call a syntactical nuance. Okay? In other words, sometimes it's translated with a slightly different nuance. So when you get a present indicative in a story, it has to be a narrative, not like a letter that Paul is writing, but a story, like narrative material, and it's surrounded by some other past tense verbs. What the author is signaling there is this is a historical present. You need to translate it as a past tense, not as a present tense. You say, well, why do they put it in the present? Again, he explains it because of storytelling vividness. Okay, and then the last two things he wants to explain to you are some syntactical things. One is the use of the negative. You've learned about the u, I think, up until this point. He introduces you to a new negative particle here. So there are two negative particles in the Greek language. One is the u, and the other is the may. And I think you've learned the u earlier, and then now he's introducing you to the may. So u and may. Now, what he's saying here is when you get u and may with an indicative verb, so it's connected to a verb like don't walk or don't this or don't that. When it's connected with an indicative verb, it actually indicates an expected answer. The u indicates a yes expected answer, and the may indicates a no expected answer. So let me read it out how he writes it. So it's mainly used with the second. Oh yeah. I forgot to say that part. The u is used almost entirely with the indicative, which is the only mood you've learned. There are three other moods you're going to learn later. When you want to take another mood outside the indicative, you'll learn this later, and make it negative, they use the may. But here's the little bit of a key. When you do get the may with the indicative, that indicates a no expected answer. So he gives you a little formula there, and this is what he calls a unique use. So when, how does he say it? So Greek signals this at the very bottom of page 180. Where is it? Notice the verb is a question. Yeah. English considers a double that's the double negative. So yeah, the main thing you're looking for is if you have the may with the indicative mood, then you know it's signaling with a question mark. It's signaling, and that's the key. It has to have it's a question. It's a question. Then it's signaling the yes expected answer. Like look at the top, page 181. Are we stronger than he? So when you have a may indicative with a question mark, it's in a question. That's expecting the yes, the no answer. So again, you don't see that so much in English. So if you just translate that out in English, here's an example where knowing the Greek can help you with some interpretational understanding. So in the bottom of page 180, when he says uk emi apostolos, it just translates am I not an apostle? And again, knowing that the Greek with the u, with the question mark, and the indicative indicates a yes answer. So the speaker is saying it in such a way that he's implying the answer is yes. Am I not an apostle? Of course I am. In fact, if you wanted to bring out in English the fact that the writer insinuating, indicating a yes response. It's a rhetorical question. You'd almost have to add a whole other sentence. Am I not an apostle? Of course I am. You'd have to add that almost to bring out that nuance, which most English translations are not going to do. So he's just trying to clue you into a new use of the negative. So you're being introduced to the may, and the fact that when the may is used with an indicative in a question, it is indicating an expected answer of no. Okay? Real simple. The last thing he introduces you to in this chapter is he's beginning to introduce you to use some various uses of the genitive. Up to this point, you've been translating the genitive of with like of, or show possession, or from, which shows ablative aspect. Well, the truth is the genitive is a very versatile case, and some grammarians can have indicated some 24 or some even more than that, various nuanced translations of the genitive. You've just been learning to, possession, and ablative in a very generic way. And what he's doing in this last section on page 181 and following, 182, is introducing you to another syntactical nuance. Now, this has nothing to do with spelling. It's going to look like a genitive. It's an interpretational issue that you only get out of context. Okay, so he's kind of cluing you into this. This is going to become a major part of intermediate Greek and advanced Greek if you move on to advanced. So, for example, he's going to introduce you to two kinds of genitives, one called the subjective and one called the objective. And again, this has nothing to do with spelling. We're not talking about morphology. We're not talking about ending changes. We're talking about nuances of meaning. And so the example he gives you there is the example, the love of God. So if I write the phrase, the love of God, the truth is, this little word of in the English language is extremely ambiguous. It could have a dozen or so meanings. It have a number of meanings. Is this someone else's love of God, like my love of God? Is God the object of this love? Or is it God's love, the love of God? In other words, God's love. So if I, for example, I used this, I think with someone the other day as an example, trying to explain this. If I gave you a book and someone said, and I said, this is the book of Abraham Lincoln. Does that mean it's a book about Abraham Lincoln? Is it Abraham Lincoln's book, like he owned it, and it's about something else? Or is it a book from Abraham Lincoln or something like that? So there's a number of issues, and that's the idea here. Now here's the key with subjective and objective genitive. This is how you know to identify them or nuance them. The noun that the genitive is modifying, here this would be the case of love, whatever the noun is that the genitive is modifying, it has to have a verbal aspect to it. Not all nouns have verbal aspects, but many do. So this is a bit of you say, well, how do I know that? You know, what you might say, well, how do I know a noun has a verbal aspect? It's a bit of common sense and logic more than anything else. Sometimes in Greek you can get tipped off to the fact that there's a verb form of that noun. So love has both a noun form in the Greek and a verb form. But the idea is that there are some nouns that have such a verbal aspect to it that even as a noun, it still carries that idea of action. So to say he has the love of God, and let's pretend for a second that word God's love. He has God's love, or the love of God. Even though love in that sentence is a noun, it still carries with the idea of an action. It's not just a thing. It's God showing love is really the idea there. And so anytime you have a genitive that is modifying a noun that has an active action aspect to it, it could be, not always, but could be subjective or objective. And the difference is, subjective is the genitive, in this case, let's say it were God, would be the subject of, quote unquote, subject of the verbal noun. So it would be God's love, God doing the loving. If it were objective genitive, then somebody else is acting in love toward God. That would be acting a bit like the object of the verbal noun. Is the idea there. So he gives you a great example. You go, gosh, is that ever important? The truth is, it's important a lot, and it's very controversial. A lot of biblical passages that may surprise you. Let me write it out in Greek because I had it on the board there in English. So let's say I take that phrase as he's written on page 182. Oh, what am I doing? Agape. And I'm going to write it in 2 lines since I'm on a space here. I'm trying to write it big so you can see it. Theou. So what he's saying is if it's subjective, notice his arrows there on in the little diagram. If it's a subjective, then that means it's God's love. God is doing the love. Agape, the love of God. See, God is the genitive. If it's objective, then it's someone else loving God would be the relationship. Look at the example down there on at the bottom of the page. This comes from John. This is an example of it from 1 John chapter 2, verse 5. But whoever keeps his word, indeed, he gives you the English translation, whoever keeps his word, indeed, in this person, the person that keeps his word, the love, notice here's the phrase, exact phrase in the Greek, the love of God has been perfected. Now the question is, whose love is perfected? Well, if you translate this as a subjective genitive, it's God's love that's perfected in that person who's keeping his word. If it's an objective genitive, then it's that person who's keeping his word, that person's love in God that's perfected. So whose love is it? The person keeping the word or God's love perfected in that person? And you say, well, how would I know which one it is? You can't tell by grammar. It's just a genitive. This is an interpretational issue. The only way to know is context. So in this chapter, what kind of things do you need to really be focused on? You need to be focused on the vocabulary on page 186. You need to probably learn that chart, table 12 point. In fact, I would just tell you to learn that table 12.3 chart so that you can recognize your contract vowels when you see them, so you won't get tripped up trying to locate them. Learn on page 178 that those 3 words, in fact, sometimes I just make I think when I was learning them way back when, I made like a card, and I just put that verb on there, and I put object cases, possible object cases, and write out those cases that they can use. So each one of those can use other cases as direct objects. You know that for those 3 words. Just know, and maybe make yourself a card on the use of the new copulative verb, which I think is in your vocabulary. It's just a vocabulary word. Know that how negatives can be used, especially the may. So when you have an ou or a may with an indicative verb and a question mark, you just got to know that. So however you learn that. So a lot of times, some people like to put it on cards or write it down if that helps you. A lot of people just kind of learn it through translation. I don't know if that's something you memorize. And then just understand that last thing about the genitive. So mostly in this chapter, it's that chart on contract vowels, just knowing that one I put at the very top there at the very beginning, and vocabulary, and just some new concepts to kind of try to get a handle on in translation. All right, that's the end of that.